Historians of Reddit, what's a devastating event that no one talks about? Obligatory, not a historian, but I'm in college studying history. The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965 to 1966 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It is possibly one of the largest mass killings of the last century, and I had heard nothing about it ever. Living in the West, it's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100k to 300k, and even on up to 500k or a million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch British, had kept the house of cards balanced, but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist, and largely supported by the US, would be looking to take power. One night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, torture and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the US would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It is unclear how extensive American support to the army was, but it is probable they aided in training and may have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos are not really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly a million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. Whoa, I had no idea about this. I just commented about the Bodo League massacre, which seems to follow the same principle, up to and including tacit US support. The Victoria Hall disaster, all because kids were being kids in a death trap. The disaster started when about 1,000 children and the audience of a variety show were told they could get free toys. Kids began pouring down the aisles to get the toys, blocking the exits and piling on top of one another. In the end, 183 of them were crushed to death. The Andijan massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It is largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US-governed UN tried to investigate. A terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. Man, I'm from Kazakhstan and heard about every other thing mentioned in comments, but not crap that happened right in the neighboring country. I'm not really a proper historian, but I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point it all fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. The Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit. Volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war and invasions from foreigners that came by boat that historians have named the Sea People because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some or even all of them. Again, I'm not a proper historian by any means, but this is what I heard. Actual historians, feel free to correct any mistakes or mention something I missed. The Hittites are especially interesting since we had no hard evidence for them till the 19th century. The only mention of them was the Bible, and people thought there was no way a nation as powerful as described could just up and vanish, so it had to be mythological. The lo and behold big old Bronze Age empire. This is fairly recent. Started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. I'm always amazed that people know so little about Pol Pot and Cambodia. His regime killed 25% of its population. Let that sink in. 1 in 4. If you were educated, you were first killed. Baghdad used to be one of the biggest and most vibrant cities in the world in the 1200s, until the Mongols came. Baghdad did not recover its year 1200 population until the 1980s. It was, in fact, the most populous city in the world for quite some time during the Middle Ages. It was also the epicenter of intellectual, cultural, and artistic exchange for scholars and other brilliant thinkers the world over. And then, of course, the Mongols came. The Johnstown flood of 1889. The deadliest civil engineering disaster on US soil. It killed 2,209 people. After a dam collapsed, it swept up rail cars, passengers, trees, an entire town of 10,000. Then swirled it around and ejected the debris downriver into a bridge where it all caught fire. Destruction beyond belief. And also that some rich steel magnates up the mountain didn't maintain the dam they used to keep their fishing reservoir. It's worse. The rich wanted to take their carriages across the dam, but the top of the dam was too narrow for their carriages. So to save money they lowered it, which made it wider, but also destabilized the dam. They were warned about this, but because they're rich buttholes they didn't care. So it wasn't that they didn't maintain the dam, it was them actively fricking it up. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Attu. On the island was the village of Attu where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife's schoolteacher and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps where men died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited, basically, driving the Attu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Attu tribe they destroyed. Due to its lack of population and unique location, Attu has become a bastion for bird watching enthusiasts, aka birders, as featured in the Steve Martin comedy The Big Ear, which itself is a relatively unknown and underrated comedy. Typing Heavenly Kingdom of Hongzhiquan. Put simply, it was an upsurp kingdom in 1850s China that directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions, maybe 10 million plus of people through massacre and famine. Hongzhiquan believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and persuaded enough people to follow along and start a civil war. Check out God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence. 10 million combatants, could be as many as double that when counting civilian deaths. In only 14 years, the entire period of Qing collapse would fit this thread tbh. So much of it is batshit insane and tragic. The Mayan society and the lost scriptures that we still haven't found, on top of the scriptures we still can't seem to decipher. And basically just how much culture was torched by Spain during the Conquista and the colonial period. Frankly, I'm amazed the Maya language is still alive. I was fascinated with the story of the Osage Indians in the United States. The book Colors of the Flower Moon is an excellent book detailing what happened. Basically, they got sent to Oklahoma and found huge oil reserves on their land. They were rich and hired white people as servants, which didn't go over well. People tried to marry in to get part of the riches. There were tons of murders, and the investigation led to the creation of the FBI in the United States. The Taiping Rebellion. Around the same time as the American Civil War, a massive civil war raged in China. The rebellion was led by Hongzhiquan, who proclaimed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Estimated 20-30 million dead. For reference, 1 million died in the American Civil War. Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt, but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. There's a great book about this called Isaac Storm by Eric Larson. The Bronze Age collapse, arguably more devastating than the fall of the West Roman Empire. So much knowledge lost. Truly one of history's great mysteries. I recommend reading up on it. It's really interesting. Until I learned about it, I had no idea that there was once a whole other Dark Ages that happened before what we normally think of as the Dark Ages. Although that term is a misnomer, the Bronze Age collapse ushered in a centuries-long Dark Age that lasted until classical Greece. The Rwandan genocide has got to be one of these events. I watched Shake Hands with the Devil here a while ago and highly recommend it. Unspeakable acts of brutality inflicted. Still gives me chills. In 535, humans went through heck. Many reported a strange color in the skies, not just in Europe. A dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions, now known as the Americas, weren't spared. For example, drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. Something similar happened in 1816, the year with it, a summer that was caused by a volcano in Indonesia erupting in 1815. 10 tragic days during the Mexican Revolution. US Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson conspired with the nephew of the former Mexican president and Mexican Army general in the US Embassy in Mexico City to assassinate the newly elected president of Mexico. Absolutely wild and tragic assassination that shook Mexico in 1913. We talk a lot about Columbine and Sandy Hook, but few people nowadays remember the 1927 bombing of the school in Bath, Michigan, or the explosion of a school in New London, Texas in 1937 that, in addition to killing almost 300 people, launched the career of a cub reporter named Walter Cronkite. The Bath massacre was mostly done with dynamite, wired into the school by a disgruntled janitor who also killed his wife and some of his livestock. And the New London disaster is why natural gas, which is odorless, has an unpleasant smelling gas added to it. Some people who went to parts of the school in the days preceding the blast complained of headaches and dizziness, but nobody could figure out why. I grew up an hour or so away from New London. It's since been renamed to West Rusk, and they were in my school's competition district, so we visited there occasionally for band, sports, etc. That whole town has a wildly unsettling energy. The Sea Peoples and Bronze Age collapse associated with it. Seriously, over 1,000 years of culture and progress lost in 100 years. Basically, everything collapsed except Egypt, and it was damaged heavily by the loss of trade and having to defend itself from invasion. Also not a historian, but learning about the Beslan school siege in Russia was heartbreaking. As kids were settling down for the first day of the class, the school was attacked by Chechen terrorists. I think over 300 people, half of whom were kids, died over the course of 3 days. I was only 8 years old at the time, but I vividly remember seeing it on television. The reporter said the kids had started drinking their own urine to survive. Vietnamese boat people, absolutely crazy and literally can't believe this happened, and nobody freaking ever talks about it. Think about this, it's the Vietnam War, and you are Vietnamese and obviously want nothing to do with it. Many saw their only way out was by sea, due to tensions with neighboring countries. So hordes of people tried to escape the country in little boats. Now here's the kicker, it's estimated that up to 400,000 of them drowned. Most of the women got raped by pirates as well. Everything got stolen. People got sick and starved. Pirates kidnapped people. Absolutely horrible. That wiki page makes me feel bad for ever having complained about anything. My parents and grandparents were part of this historical event. My dad ended up in Macau and he said he saw many people die on the boat he was on. I think a church in the US then sponsored him and my family to immigrate. The Sand Creek Massacre. US troops slaughtered an unprotected village, which was flying the white flag of surrender at the time and full of women and children, murdering at least 150. possibly many more of them, almost unspeakably brutally. The victims were Southern Cheyenne who had already ceded their territory in compliance with the US government and had relocated to Sand Creek under US military orders. At the time of the attack, the encampment was flying both the American flag and the white flag of surrender. I'll let Wikipedia take it from here. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces. Worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces, with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. John S. Smith. Congressional testimony of Mr. John S. Smith, 1865. 24. I saw one squaw lying on the bank, whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open, with an unborn child lying by her side. Robert Bent, New York Tribune, 1879. 20. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bee. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. Major Anthony, New York Tribune, 1879. 25. Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of white antelope, lying solitarily in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles, the last for a tobacco pouch. Stan Hoig, 26. After the smoke cleared, Chivington's men came back and killed many of the wounded. They also scalped many of the dead, regardless of whether they were women, children or infants. Chivington and his men dressed their weapons, hats and gear with scalps and other body parts, including human fetuses and male and female genitalia. 37. They also publicly displayed these battle trophies in Denver's Apollo Theater and area saloons. I saw another source once mentioning baby shoes from the massacre with tiny feet still inside them being sold by the soldiers as souvenirs. The Colorado History Museum in Denver recently came under some deserved scrutiny for portraying Sand Creek as a battle rather than a massacre. The Kadinka tragedy was supposed to be a celebration of the crowning of Nicholas II as emperor. Around 500,000 people gathered in a field where they would receive free food. Rumors spread that there wouldn't be enough food for everyone, leading to a panic and everyone rushing the field. 1,389 people were trampled to death. Nicholas II responded by going to a party that night. He and his wife didn't want to go to the ball, but his advisors and his powerful uncles insisted, so they went anyway. Apparently both spent the ball with red-rimmed eyes. Not that this excuses their behavior, but their initial reactions were to mourn the loss of their people. With 2k plus comments, I don't think anyone will see it, but the genocide in East Timor by the Indonesian army. Numbers comparable to the Khmer's, but it received zero press attention. Kissinger is known to have turned a blind eye on the ethnic religious killings get closer to the Indonesians during the Cold War due to its strategic placement. The Milan Conference. Back in 1880, a bunch of educators of the deaf all decided to meet in Milan to determine how best to teach deaf people. 164 delegates were in attendance, only one of whom was deaf. At the time, there was a conflict among educators of deaf people about whether an oralism or manualism based approach was better. Proponents of oralism argued that deaf people would never succeed in society if they could not speak and hold a conversation in the same way a hearing person would. To this end, anyone who attempted to sign would be punished, and deaf people were forced to lip read. At the end of the conference, sign language was banned in all educational institutions, and deaf people were not allowed to teach, for fear that it would encourage the use of sign language. As a result, for roughly 100 years, Deaf people were essentially isolated from communication and unable to form communities. To this day, amongst older generations of deaf people, many still have never learned to sign. In addition, deaf culture as a whole was and is profoundly affected by this event, because it essentially stole stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, erasing the history of deaf people and the deaf community. Asked my history studying friend about this, she said there's a lot of events that people don't talk about. For example, there was a lot of countries involved in the Balkan conflict who knew about the massacre of Srebrenica but still allowed it to happen. So many historical events are just so grim and depressing when you read about it. We knew bad things were happening but didn't stop until it was too late for many people. The role of the Netherlands in the massacre is often heavily overlooked when this massacre is taught honestly. Bronze Age collapse is the biggest one. Treblinka gets overshadowed by Auschwitz a lot, and the actual detailed description of the devastation of the American-Indian Wars. The Cathar genocide in southern France, where an entire group of people were brutally wiped out for believing in a different type of Christianity at the time of the Crusades. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones and totally helpless to do anything about it. BHC equals British home children. Poor British children were taken from their families and sold to Canada as indentured servants' farmhands. Many of these children were never checked on, were not paid, educated, fed, or clothed properly, and endured cruel and unusual treatment. Some died, but most ran away. Britain was doing this until in 1967 sending kids to the colonies to live on farms in Australia, Canada, NZ, essentially as unpaid servants for most of them. It didn't go well for a lot of them. The assassination of James Garfield. He was a known advocate for racial equality. He appointed black men into his cabinet and tried expanding public education into the South to get more African Americans an education. He tried to fight for racial equality but died 4 months into his presidency, which fricked it up. Candice Millard's Destiny of the Republic not only does an excellent job of recounting these events, but postulates that Garfield had potential to be one of America's best presidents. Instead, he died a half-rotten husk, all because his doctors refused to practice sanitation. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. The Sixties Scoop. In Canada, from the late 1950s to 1980s, the government removed Indigenous children from their homes and families and placed them up for adoption or in foster care. Most remained in Canada, but some were sent to the US or Western Europe. The majority were placed with white middle-class families. A number of them experienced abuse. This even furthered the loss of their culture. The English rule over Ireland. I guess it's not an event so much as a period, but still, many died directly and indirectly. For example, the famines. Yes, famines plural. There were more than the big one. Irish culture, language and many customs were made illegal, were suppressed to the point of near extinction. Land was stolen and given to English settlers. There was religious persecution, which would create a divide still present today. Little to no political autonomy. Reprisals against civilians for any resistance. Many think of Ireland simply as a green island with a bunch of gingers who drink a lot, but its history is written in the blood of millions. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.